Everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the second annual Maine Rec Therapy Association Conference. I want to introduce our first speaker. Our speaker is Carol Starr. She's the founder and facilitator of the award-winning volunteer group Brain Injury Voices. After her brain injury in 1999, Carol changed from being an active professional to a professional patient, struggling to accept new limitations and a life forever changed. Recreational activities played an important role in helping her to regain skills, accept her brain injury, and find new ways to thrive. In this inspiring speech, Carol will share her journey back to happiness and offer insight into how TR benefits brain injury patients. So let's welcome Carol.
Thank you. Well, good morning. I am so delighted to be here today. Recreation therapy has a special place in my heart because of the critical role that it played in my journey after brain injury. I most definitely would not be here today without recreational activities. Recreation therapy was a cornerstone of my brain injury rehab, and it helped me find a new life. If you separate the letters of recreation, it becomes a recreation, which I think is a really cool linguistic trick. Recreation is the journey that I've been on since my brain injury 16 years ago. So I want to start out by thanking all of you for the work you do that helps people like me, people who've had their lives profoundly changed by illness or injury, to recreate themselves through recreation. I've got several goals for my speech this morning. One, I want to share with you some of the symptoms of brain injury and the challenges of coping with them. What I'm going to focus on is so-called mild brain injury because it is most common and it's what I know and deal with. It's definitely an injury that's in the news a lot these days due to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and concussions in sports. By the end of my talk, I really hope that you hate the word mild as much as I do. Mild implies that the injury is no big deal, but that isn't necessarily the case. Mild traumatic brain injury can be a very serious condition with potentially lifelong consequences. Two, I'm going to be talking about the difficulties of living with a disability that's mostly hidden. I look just fine. You would never know that there's anything wrong with me. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a great deal of struggle that goes on beneath my surface. And three, I'm going to be sharing my personal journey back to happiness after brain injury, with a specific focus on how recreational activities helped me. There's an old John Lennon song that says, "Life happens while we're busy making other plans." Isn't that one the truth? Before my injury, I thought my life story was going to go like an arrow, mostly up. I was going to continue to build my teaching career. I was going to get married, have a family. I knew, of course, there were going to be ups and downs and bends in the road, just like everybody has in life. But absolutely nowhere in my life story was there room for a Mercury Sable going 50 miles an hour to broadside me on the driver's side at age 32. I was rather early in my adult life and career, and it left me with a lifelong brain injury. But that is what happened. My story is not one of making a miraculous recovery and triumphing over brain injury through grit and determination and hard work. I have tons of grit and determination, and I've worked harder at brain injury recovery than I have worked at anything in my entire life. But I still have a brain injury with symptoms that I cope with every day. So instead, my story is a quieter one of coming to terms with, of accepting the life-changing challenges of brain injury, of learning how to be happy, even with a disability. I recognize that it's likely that there are only a few of you in this audience who work with brain injury patients. But I imagine most of you work with people whose lives have been changed by injury or illness, people who are struggling to adapt, who want to be happy again, to find meaning and purpose in their lives. So my hope is that even though this is my brain injury story, that you'll find strategies that apply to whatever population you work with. So please take whatever's useful and leave the rest behind. I'm going to begin my story with two quotes. The first is by Helen Keller. Being left blind and deaf from scarlet fever, she knew a lot about living with a disability. She said, When one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened before us. The second quote is by Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. He knew a lot about fighting battles that at first seemed hopeless. He said, "Never, never, never give up." I combined the two of those quotes to create the title for my speech, Never Give Up on Happiness. Brain injury, like so many life-changing conditions, it tends to do quite the number on happiness. It can change or destroy so many of life's fulfilling aspects, like the ability to hold a job, to socialize with family and friends, to enjoy recreational activities, to take care of oneself. It doesn't just close a door of happiness, it slams it shut, then for good measure burns it. At least that's how it felt to me, particularly early on. To find happiness again, I had to tear myself away from the wreckage of the old door of my life, find the new door, and figure out how to unlock it. For a really long time after my injury, I wanted desperately for somebody to ride in on the white horse and give me a definitive plan. To say, if you see these doctors and these therapists do these exercises in the correct order, you will make a full recovery. It seemed like I found treatments that helped haphazardly, and nobody could guarantee me that full recovery that I so much wanted. Breaking one's brain is not like breaking an arm or a leg, where there's an expected course of recovery. Eventually, I had to accept that life with a brain injury is a long, bumpy road of twists and turns and dead ends, hills and valleys, of good days and bad. That's why Winston Churchill's advice to never give up is so very important. Looking back now, 16 years post-injury, I can identify key actions and moments that helped me along my bumpy road back to happiness. I just used the word key on purpose, because I'm going to continue with Helen Keller's metaphor of the door. The 3 keys to finding and unlocking my door of happiness have included regaining independence, competence, and purpose, as well as a few big moments, which I can only describe as epiphanies, and those I'll get to later on in the speech. What I would like to do now is just tell you a little bit about myself before my brain injury, and then what happened in its aftermath, and that will give you some context as I share my journey back to happiness. In my pre-accident life, 2 of the things that made me happiest were my work, teaching, and my primary recreational activity, classical music. I think all of us have core identities. I've always been a teacher at my core. Teaching has been part of my life story, beginning way back in elementary school when I used to tutor my classmates. No matter where I was, I always seemed to find a way to teach. After I got my master's degree in adult education, I was primarily self-employed as a corporate trainer. I would go into local businesses and teach soft skill type courses to workers. I used to say I'd teach anything but math. I really liked to learn new material, to figure out how to communicate it to others. I'm somebody who I really like feeling good at what I do, and teaching made me feel very confident and competent. Outside of work, I was very involved in classical music. That was my primary recreational activity. I had played the violin for 23 years. I was in a community orchestra. I also sang in a chorus. I absolutely loved being a musician. I loved rehearsing, performing, being surrounded by sound. Music gave me the opportunity to be part of something that was bigger than me. There are a lot of people who love loud rock music. I loved loud classical music. Yeah, I was kind of a nerd, I admit it. I thought I was going to be an amateur musician for the rest of my life. On July 6th, 1999, I was on my way from one teaching job to another when I was broadsided on the driver's side by a car going about 50 miles an hour. The last thing I remember is a really loud sound of metal on metal. The airbags went off, windows were broken, the car spun 180 degrees and went across the median. But I don't have any memory of any of those things. I only know they happened because I read the accident report later on. I was taken by ambulance to the emergency room, and they sent me home with just a diagnosis of whiplash. My head did hurt at the time, but somehow I didn't know to tell them that. I was also asked if I remembered everything. I confidently answered yes. not realizing that my memory of the event actually had some rather large holes in it. So now, whenever I talk to medical professionals, I like to mention the importance of asking the right questions, of how crucial simple phrasing can be, especially for somebody with cognitive issues. Had I been asked, "Does your head hurt?" Had I been asked, "What do you remember about the accident?" That would have elicited different information from me, and maybe the injury would have been diagnosed right there in the emergency room. It took about 6 weeks for people to realize that there was more going on with me than just whiplash. And interestingly, it was actually the physical therapist that I was seeing for the whiplash who first recognized that I had a brain injury. And then it was nearly a year before I received formal brain injury rehabilitation for it. I can tell you that was the worst year of my entire life. Unfortunately, for so-called mild injuries like mine, that delay in diagnosis and treatment is just heartbreakingly common. I can't tell you the number of people that I know who have stories similar to mine. And it leads to so much unnecessary suffering. What the word mild means is it has nothing to do with the amount of damage done to my life. All mild means is that I was unconscious for fewer than 20 minutes. When I tried to go back to my normal life after the accident, it became apparent that something was very wrong. I was utterly exhausted, and my head just hurt all the time. It would feel like literally somebody was squeezing the left side of my brain. I tried to go back to work. I was only teaching 2 hours, one class. I had a co-facilitator helping me. After 2 hours of teaching, I would literally spend 2 days on my couch, flat on my back, too exhausted to do much of anything. I couldn't remember my students' names. Every time they walked in the door, I'd say, "Are you new?" I couldn't remember what we discussed, what we were doing. I'd stick them in groups and just leave them there because I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't seem to follow my own lesson plan, a lesson plan that I had written. It seemed like everybody was speaking so fast, and I just couldn't focus or follow what was going on in my own class. It's hard to explain the crushing mental fatigue that even the simplest of activities would bring on for me. For example, my morning shower. Every day, my morning shower would absolutely exhaust me. Exhaust me to the point where I would get out of the shower and hit the couch, wet hair and all. So I had really bad hair days for about the first year and a half after my injury. How many of you have pulled all-nighters in your past? So you know what that kind of fatigue feels like. All-nighter fatigue is a cakewalk compared to brain injury fatigue. It was unlike any other kind of fatigue I had ever experienced in my life. I also tried to return to music. Now, I had played in orchestras since I was a child, so it was always like another home for me. It wasn't anymore. Walking in with everybody getting ready and warming up, it sounded so loud to me that I started to cry instantly. I couldn't seem to tune out the noise, and I got so confused that I didn't know where to sit in an orchestra I had played in for 10 years. I opened my violin case. One of my strings was broken. I didn't know how to change it. I'd been changing violin strings for decades. I couldn't even remember how to drive home, so a friend had to drive me home. I literally spent days on my couch recovering from just a few minutes of music. It seemed like it was the ultimate cruel joke to curse a musician with this intolerance to sound. I didn't understand it then, but what had happened is that my brain injury had left me with something called hyperacusis, an extreme sensitivity to sound. Every kind of noise sounded louder to me than it really was. For example, whenever planes would go up overhead, even if I was inside, I would literally duck, because to me, it sounded like it was coming in the room with me. A sudden loud sound, like an alarm, would cause me to scream and oftentimes fall. I have earplugs in right now, and I've got headphones over there, just in case there's a loud noise. It really felt like my entire life, including the activities that had made me happy, were just collapsing around me. I was also struggling with basic life activities. At the grocery store, I would stand in the produce section for very long periods of time with an apple in each hand, going, which one do I buy? I was the valedictorian of my high school class, third in my college class. I have a master's degree. I was bamboozled by apples. Once I spent half an hour in the bread aisle because they were out of the brand that I buy, and I had no idea what to do. I'm a grown woman, but I had to call my mother to say, what do I do? Her words to me were, get out. Leave the cart, leave the store. The food that I did buy would go bad because I didn't seem to know what to do with it anymore. For some strange reason, to this day I don't know why, I got fixated on cottage cheese. That's what I ate for dinner most nights. Still, when I get really tired, that's what I go for, is cottage cheese. I'd always loved to read, and suddenly I just stopped reading books and magazines, the paper, because it was hard to focus and follow the words on the page. Family gatherings, which I'd always enjoyed, just suddenly became unbearable. I had a hard time holding a conversation, especially if there was more than one person in the room or there was a lot of background noise. I couldn't remember what people were telling me. I did try to hide that. They probably figured it out, though. My speaking was slow and halted. I'd often lose my words. Most of the time in groups, I just didn't say anything. I felt so alone, like I was a stranger among the people who knew me best, my own family. I'd often call them, all lost and confused, and say, I don't know what to do. Or I think even more difficult for them, I'd have a good half hour, and I'd think, okay, I can go back to work full time. So I'd call and tell them that, and then be really upset when they told me that they disagreed, that I was ready to go back to work. I felt like I was a burden to my family and friends, like I was a failure as an adult. My emotions were just all over the place. I cried a lot over the strangest of things. I sobbed over sappy commercials on television, whenever plans would change, when a bumblebee got into my house. When that bumblebee got into my house, I literally slid down the wall sobbing. You would not think that the Rose Bowl parade could be tear-worthy television, but it was for me. I seriously wondered if I was going crazy. I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, if I pushed harder, I could make this thing go away by sheer force of will. I'd always been somebody who believed that anything is possible if you just work hard enough. For the first time in my life, that wasn't true anymore. The harder I pushed, the worse everything got. I just felt like I was a failure at life, failure at everything. While all of that turmoil was going on inside my head, while I was struggling so much, there are people who told me, you look great, you're doing fine. But I wasn't. Sometimes I almost wish that I had a cane or a cast or something visible that would let people know that I had an injury, that I needed help. That's one of the hardest parts of having an invisible disability. Yes, nobody stares at me in the supermarket. But unless people know what to look for, unless they know to look at the woman with the apples going, what do I buy? People don't always recognize just how difficult life can be with a brain injury. Even when I would try to explain what was happening, people would often say things to me like, oh, that happens to me too, which just dismissed the difficulties I was having as ordinary, run-of-the-mill stuff that happens to everybody, which they were not. So I am here to tell you that, oh, that happens to me too, and you look great, are probably two of the worst things that you can say to somebody with a hidden disability. Because even though we might look just fine, our brains are working 100 times harder to do even simple activities that everybody else does without thinking. Early on, I didn't have a way to respond to those statements. I didn't have the words to describe the invisible struggle that was going on inside me. It took me years to learn how to describe my brain injury experience and to not be hurt by comments like, you look great, and oh, that happens to me too. Actually, recreational activities helped me to learn that. Until that level of wisdom came, I was just traumatized by people's comments. And yes, sometimes those comments came from medical professionals, which just made things worse. I blamed myself for not trying hard enough, for being weak, for being lazy, and none of those judgments were true. I ended up having to stop both teaching and music. My life was pretty much reduced to medical appointments and 4 naps a day. If I was up for an hour, that was a big achievement. The grief over all of those losses was overwhelming. I really thought it was going to break me. I'm sure everybody in this room can relate to the grief after losing a loved one. My mother died 5 years ago, and I can honestly say that the grief I felt after brain injury was worse than the grief that I felt after her death. After the brain injury, there were times, more than I'd like to admit, when I thought seriously about ending my life. I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote about that time. It's called Phoenix. At the end of my street, on the edge of the marsh, stands a tree. She does more than stand. She commands your attention. Full of her fall flash. No ordinary orange, red, and yellow for her. She sparkles with crimson, magenta, umber, and ochre plumage. A rising phoenix with outstretched wings, confident and bold. But her time is brief. Perhaps her colors burned too brightly. Her plumage dulls, darkens, and drops, exposing frail gray bones, pale and naked. Who is she now? The tree will have her time again. Will I? Several years later, I answered that last question in another poem, and I will share that towards the end of my remarks. So to recap, here are the major brain injury symptoms I was, and in varying degrees still am, dealing with. Extreme mental fatigue that requires daily nap times. Difficulties with executive function, planning, organizing, decision-making. A reduced ability to concentrate, pay attention, and remember. Sound, light, and balance sensitivities. And emotional issues, including sadness and feelings of loss. Now, I just spent a fair amount of time describing all the different ways that the brain injury has impacted me in my professional life, my recreational life, family life, activities of daily living, my deepest sense of self. Because brain injury is an all-encompassing life event. It affects everything. No part of life is left untouched. That's part of what makes the journey back to happiness so challenging. So now I'm going to move into that journey, the meat of this speech, the process of refinding happiness. As I mentioned earlier, my 3 keys to happiness have been regaining independence, competence, and purpose. I think it's kind of interesting that those 3 keys, they really mirror the process that we all go through as we grow up. As we mature, we move from dependence on adults to independence. We strive to discover our competencies, what we're good at, and to answer the eternal question of why are we here? What is our purpose on the planet? I really think of my brain injury journey as a regrowing up process. And because of that, I call the day of my car accident, July 6, 1999, my 2nd birthday. And I now celebrate that day as the day that my new life started. So I'm officially sweet 16. So I'm really glad that this second adolescence has not come with pimples so far. For the first several years after my brain injury, I really did feel like my life was over. I just couldn't imagine how I was ever going to be able to lead a full, happy, and productive life again. My journey back begins with my first key, regaining independence. For me, regaining independence has centered on being able to take care of myself at home and function out in the world. After my injury, I absolutely hated what I'd been reduced to. It was my occupational therapist who helped me to develop strategies and routines to regain my independence. We just start small, find success, and then build on it. Brain injury or not, that's actually a pretty good plan for most tasks. Start small, find success, and build on it. The trouble was, at first, I did not want to start small. I was kind of stubborn. There are some people in this room who might say I'm still kind of stubborn. I wanted to start on the big things, the activities that had made me happy, teaching and music. In that way, I think I was very similar to a lot of patients, that you want to start on the big things. You don't want to start small, but that was the only way that it was going to work if I started small. I thought that if only I could get back to the activities that had made me happy, and do them like I used to, that everything would be okay. However, I tried many times. I failed. And those repeated failures just gouged huge chunks out of my self-confidence and self-esteem. And every time I failed, I hated myself even more. I had to start where I was, to think smaller, and to change my focus, to relearn how to manage the basic tasks of everyday life. Things like shopping and meal planning, cooking, bill paying, running errands, taking care of my house, visiting with family and friends. Until I got the basics, the small picture stuff mastered, nothing else was going to work. I needed strategies for every single one of those things. Those tasks which I used to do just matter of course, easy. No, they weren't easy anymore. I needed those strategies. I so rebelled at first against using strategies. Whenever I thought about strategies, it brought to mind a 4-letter word beginning with F. No, it is not the swear word you might be thinking of right now. It's fear. I was scared, that if I used strategies to get things done, then my brain wasn't healing. It was like I was giving up, letting the injury win. With a lot of help from many people, I eventually realized that success with strategies feels a heck of a lot better than failure without them. I realized that I have to do what works for my brain right now, not what used to work, not what I wished would work. That hasn't been an easy lesson for me, but it is crucial for refinding happiness. When I focus on what I can't do, it's really easy to spiral down into grief and self-pity, which is a very lonely and soul-sucking kind of place. Yes, having a brain injury does suck. But when I focus on what I can do using strategies, that makes brain injury suck just a little bit less. I can't stress enough how important it was to find ways to experience success. Successes don't have to be big, just meaningful. Finally experiencing success, even when success was just cooking dinner, no cottage cheese. That was so important to rebuilding my self-esteem. Experiencing success helped me to stay positive and motivated me to continue working on my strategies. Gradually, I worked on being out in the world more with family and friends, and then more on my own. I'm now up to the point where on my own, I can be out of the house for about 4 to 5 hours a few days a week. It's taken me 16 years to reach that level of endurance. Progress has been slow and halting, but it is there. To give you an idea of the pace of brain injury recovery, 5 years ago, I gave a version of this speech at the Maine Occupational Therapy Conference. At that time, for the very first time, I had been out of the house for 5 hours. It was a tremendous success for me. It has taken me 5 years to get to the point where I can be out of the house for 5 hours, 2, maybe 3 times a week. That's just the pace of brain injury recovery. That's how it works. I celebrate every little success because each one is a triumph, because each one does increase my independence. As a result of using a lot of strategies, most of the time, I'm now able to successfully organize my day. I can shop for groceries and other necessities. No more standing in the grocery store with the apples. Earplugs, I also have special glasses. They help me function out in the world, albeit it is for a limited time. I will be on my couch napping for most of this afternoon. I've had to realize and accept that independence after brain injury is quite different than it was before. Independence doesn't necessarily mean doing everything on my own. Sometimes independence means asking for and receiving help from my family, friends, and medical professionals. As much as I hate to admit it, for a really long time, my team was so much better at assessing my capabilities than I was. I've tended to overestimate what I could do, with very interesting consequences at times. Literally, everybody I know has had to rescue me at some point and drive me home because I've overloaded and I couldn't get there. By following my team's advice, my awareness and judgment improved. As a result, I don't need rescuing as much anymore. It's meant that my life has lost a lot of its spontaneity. Everything I do takes careful planning. But that is how success happens. I've now come to the point where I know my injury well enough to manage myself and trust my judgment most of the time. Gradually, as I felt more independent, I stopped hating myself. I didn't yet like myself again, and I still felt useless most of the time, but at least not quite so helpless. So independence alone, that wasn't enough to make me happy. I needed more. I needed to feel competent again. This is where recreational activities were so pivotal in my journey. All of us, brain injury or not, need to feel good at something. For much of my life, my sense of self was based on how much I could do and how well I could do it. I'm one of those classic type A perfectionist high achievers. Because my sense of self was so closely tied to my ability to achieve, when that changed, I just totally lost myself. I've never felt more adrift in my entire life. Every psychologist and counselor that I met with told me that people like me, high achievers, often had an especially difficult time adapting to and accepting all of the losses that come with brain injury. In my case, they were all correct. But as an aside for me now at this point, the difficulty of that task and the reward of happiness are made all that much sweeter because of the length of the journey. To regain competence, I had to find new activities that I could enjoy and feel successful at. That began with recreational pursuits. I was very surprised after my brain injury to discover a new desire to make things, to use my hands to create, which was something I had never done before and had no interest in before my brain injury. To this day, I am so proud that I listened to that little voice inside that said, make something. I think we all have that little voice that whispers to us, that can guide us toward happiness, if we can just pause to hear it. As recreational therapists, you're all in a prime position to help your patients listen to their little voice inside. Listening to that quiet voice that said, make something, was the very first time that I turned away from beating loudly and unsuccessfully at my old door of happiness and toward opening the new one. Because using my hands was so different, I didn't have any comparison to how the old Carol would have done it. So it didn't activate my grief over what I'd lost. I started out very simply with a basic paint by number. This is it right here. Because of my difficulties with fatigue, concentration, and attention, I could only work at this thing for about 15 minutes at a time. Then I'd be so tired, I'd have to lie down and take a nap. But I loved working on this paint by number. I liked to see the colors come together. I liked the satisfying feeling of actually being able to start and finish something. I felt relaxed while I worked on this. Successfully finishing this paint by number spurred me on to try other crafts, such as jewelry making. I made the jewelry that I'm wearing today. I also did cross-stitching. I made these and lots of different things. Through crafts, I regained some of my ability to concentrate and pay attention. Completing projects gave me a sense of mastery and accomplishment that had been stripped away by the brain injury. Through crafts, I also observed my sense of self returning. For a long time after the injury, I felt like my only identity was that of professional patient. All I had to talk about with others was my brain injury and all that I had lost. Crafts gave me another topic to talk about, another identity. By making gifts, I could give to others instead of always receiving help. It was so rewarding for me when people would look at things and say, oh, would you make this for me? I felt like I could be useful to others. Receiving recreation therapy brought the competence I received from crafts to a whole new level. While I was an outpatient, I participated in an art show organized by the rec therapist. It was a great way to work on my executive function skills, planning, organizing, and decision-making. I experienced such pride every time I walked by that jewelry display with all of my work in that case. I brought family and friends into the hospital to see it. I took pictures of it. People even bought my jewelry, which made me feel even prouder. Pride in myself was something that brain injury had stripped away. Through recreation therapy, it began to come back. Pride and competence grew side by side. There was still more competence to be gained from crafts and recreation therapy. As part of my treatment, I began to teach other brain injury survivors how to make jewelry. I got to help others realize some of the same benefits I had gotten from crafts. I received support from the recreation therapist as I learned my limits, how much teaching I could do before fatigue and confusion took over. I generally learned those limits the hard way and often had to be led to a cot to lie down for a while afterwards because I overdid it. But ever so gradually, I learned to listen to my brain injury, learned to listen to the symptoms, and to stop before I got too tired to drive home, before I forgot where I lived. I had thought that teacher was an identity that was lost to me forever, but I learned that it wasn't. That with strategies and pacing, I could be a teacher again, just in a different way. That increased my feelings of pride and competence even more. 12 years ago, I participated in a workshop on creativity at the Maine Brain Injury Conference. I had a table where I displayed my crafts. Deciding what to bring and putting together a portfolio of my brain injury accomplishments were tasks that I did as part of recreation therapy. At that workshop, I had my first opportunity to speak briefly in front of a group again. I was so nervous. I think my right leg shook the entire time. But it felt like I was coming home. And for the first time since my accident in 1999, my way forward was clear. I knew that brain injury speaking was what I wanted to do more of. Over the last 12 years, I've gone from being part of panel discussions, to giving short talks, to organizing workshops, to delivering keynote speeches. My dream is to be a national keynote speaker. So far, I've spoken at events in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. I'm getting there. 5 years ago, I co-founded Brain Injury Voices. We are a volunteer group of survivors. Ted and Rory over there are members, as is Ross back at the video camera. Our mission is 3 words: educate, advocate, and support. What we do is we educate medical professionals and the general public about brain injury from the survivor point of view. We advocate for the importance of brain injury rehab services like therapeutic recreation. We support other survivors through peer mentoring. We're brain injury survivors who've combined our individual strengths to pay it forward, to make a difference as a group. Last year, we received a prestigious National Volunteer Award, one of just 4 in the country, from the American Hospital Association. We traveled to Washington, D.C. for that recognition ceremony. As our staff liaison, the recreation therapist went with us on that trip. At the end, depending on time, I have a video about voices that I can show. I'm proud to call myself a teacher again. Now I know that I'm probably never going to be able to hold a full-time job again, but I have found a way to have a successful volunteer career that works with what I can do right now. I can trace the competence I gained from recreational activities, beginning with this simple paint by number I did 14 years ago, to the competence I feel right now, at this very moment, talking to all of you. I had no idea of the direction that this paint by number could take me in. I think that's the wonderful thing about competence and recreational activities. When we listen to that little voice inside and do what we're good at right now, whatever that might be, we just never know the amazing directions that it can lead us in over time. For me, a big part of regaining competence has involved documenting it. A couple minutes ago, I mentioned my brain injury portfolio. It contains my post-brain injury accomplishments, both large and small, that I'm proud of or that represent progress. It's called After the Crash. I have it with me. It is over here. As you can see, it's a little large. So my other name for it is the Beast. This huge binder started out as just a little thin manila folder that lived in my desk called Stuff I'm Proud Of. And as I did things that I was proud of, I just put documentation in there. And then I didn't know what to do with this for a long time as part of recreation therapy. Before I spoke at that first conference, we put all the stuff out on the table, and I learned how to categorize, more executive function practice. And it started to become this huge binder. And over the years, I've had to buy bigger and bigger binders so it will all fit in one. This thing includes pictures of crafts that I've made, poems I've written, presentations I've done, the meal plan my OT and I developed so I don't have to eat cottage cheese for dinner anymore, programs from events I've gone to, my volunteer activities. Whenever I feel down, this portfolio brings me back up. It reminds me just how far I've come. Activities that are in the back that were once supremely difficult for me are now easy. Looking at its size and contents reminds me that I have a heck of a lot to be proud of. When I get sad, and sometimes I still do, about things that I still can't accomplish, this portfolio lifts me back up. As I continued to make the crafts, especially the jewelry, a lot of people told me that I could do that as a business someday. But I love these things as hobbies only. In addition to competence, it was important to find meaning and purpose in my life. This is another area where I think recreation therapy can be of great assistance to patients. In hindsight, as I think about my life before brain injury, it was full of activity and busyness, not so much on the purpose. I was running on a treadmill that just kept going faster and faster without really taking me anywhere. Some sort of crash was inevitable. I didn't really think it was going to be quite that literal. To me, purpose is a kind of inner wisdom, a deep knowing of why am I here on this planet? What do I have to offer the world? How do I make meaning out of what's happened to me in life? I think that those kinds of deep questions are not just nice to answer after a life-changing event. They're crucial to the acceptance and moving forward process. Happiness flows from having a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Research on resilience actually backs me up on this. Way back in 1946, Austrian neurologist and psychologist Viktor Frankl wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. Maybe some of you are already familiar with it. I see some nods out there. It was based on Frankl's experience as a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp. He observed that his fellow prisoners who were able to keep hold of some sense of purpose and meaning in their lives, even amidst the most horrible of circumstances, they were the ones who were able to survive longer. They emerged less psychologically scarred than others. He wrote, "Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose." In other words, if we can tap into the big picture and find some sense of purpose in life challenges like brain injury, then it is indeed possible to bear the unbearable. As awful as having a brain injury has been, one silver lining for me is that it sharply focused my sense of purpose. I found my way to make meaning, being a brain injury speaker and the leader of Brain Injury Voices. This is my life's work. Recreation therapy started the chain of events that led me to finding that purpose from brain injury. My limitations do restrict how much I can do, but I discovered that having a sense of purpose is more about quality than quantity, about choosing to make meaning out of suffering. Now, I certainly did not choose to have a brain injury, but I do choose how I look at it and what I make out of it. There are so many ways to find purpose after a life-changing event. By spending time with family and friends, volunteering, nurturing creativity through art, crafts, music, writing, helping someone, caring for animals, tending a garden, devoting time to a spiritual practice. So many of those meaning-making options are recreational activities. That's why I think it's so linguistically wonderful that recreate and recreate are the same word. One does lead to the other. For me, having a sense of meaning and purpose not only helped me find happiness, it also helped save my life. As I mentioned earlier, I've had suicidal thoughts in the past. There were a number of reasons why I never acted on them. The love and support of family and friends, counseling, medication, and purpose. I knew that I was meant to learn something from brain injury, to do something with it. And if I checked out, I was going to miss that opportunity. I had to make a choice about how I viewed brain injury. I could look at it as this random event whose only purpose was to ruin my entire life. But that wouldn't get me anywhere. Instead, I chose to view brain injury as a teacher. As I'm sure many of you experienced in school, often the toughest teachers are the ones that we learn the most from. Brain injury has so been my toughest teacher ever. The more life-changing the event, the more powerful the emotion, the more opportunity it provides us to learn. By learning from our experiences, especially the challenging ones, whether it's brain injury or something else, we can create meaning and purpose and turn emotions like anger, sadness, and fear into acceptance, self-understanding, purpose, and joy. Now, the realities of brain injury certainly have not made learning easy for me. It's been so slow going, full of trial and error, 2 steps forward followed by 1 3/4 steps backwards. There's also been times where it just felt like I wasn't moving at all. But I have learned important, meaningful, hard-won lessons in life, lessons that maybe I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I'd like to share just some of what brain injury has taught me. Brain injury, like life, is a team sport. I can't do this alone. I listen to my family, friends, and medical team and the advice they give me. It's not a sign of weakness to ask for their help. Figuring out when I need help and asking for it are actually signs of courage and insight. I focus on what I need to do to be successful in the present. Sometimes that means working hard, and sometimes that means taking a nap. I understand what it is to struggle, and I'm a better person for it. My empathy and perception skills are stronger as a result of my struggles. I might get scared and have weak moments, but my determination, motivation, and absolute refusal to give up will always win out. I'm not just a cracked version of my old self. I'm a new, whole person who is different than I used to be, but no less valuable. There are no small accomplishments. There was a time for me when successfully cooking supper was as big an achievement as standing here in front of you is now. Successes build on one another. Since this is a recreation therapy conference, I also wanted to spend some time talking specifically what I've learned from participating in rec therapy. Many of these lessons relate to living with brain injury, and some of them are more universal. Fun is possible, even with a disability. However, fun does require strategies to make it work now. Everything takes energy. Too much visual and auditory stimulation can exhaust me before I even begin an activity. Creating the proper environment for recreation matters just as much as the activity itself. Planning is needed for success. It's better to focus on activities that are doable for me now, even though they are different than what I used to do. Letting go of my past recreational pursuits was very painful, but necessary in order to accept the new Carol and to move forward with a changed life. Pacing and knowing when to stop an activity are crucial skills. I have to know my limits. When I push beyond them, it does not serve me, and it just makes life really difficult for those around me. Life works best when I stop before I'm tired. Failing at a recreational activity is an opportunity to assess and learn from it. Is it something that can be fixed with a strategy, or was it simply just too much for my brain to do? One thing means if I can fix it with a strategy, that means try it again. If it's just too much for my brain to do, it means let it go. Every recreational activity I do can help me better understand my brain injury. Self-knowledge is empowering. The better I can understand my brain injury symptoms, the better I can help others to understand them and how to help me when I need it. That's especially important because once my brain injury kicks in, I can't tell people how to help me. All I can say is, I don't know. Recreation is a way to recreate oneself. I do still have gifts to offer the world. And there are many ways to experience feelings of competence and purpose, not just what I used to do. Recreational activities are a vital healing modality. They've given a structure to my day, a topic to talk about with others, fun, friends, goals to work toward, a safe way to practice skills I lost after brain injury. It increased my self-confidence and self-esteem. They've been a cornerstone of my recovery process. As you can probably tell, I believe very strongly in the value of reflection and learning as a path to meaning and purpose. Thinking, writing, and talking about my brain injury have helped me to make sense of everything that's happened to me. The more I understand my story, the more able I am to then use that story to help others. So now, I want to give all of you a chance to reflect on your own stories, to think about what you've learned from being recreation therapists, to tap into your sense of purpose. So I have an interactive exercise for everybody to do. It was handed out at the beginning. Does everybody have it? It's one question that's divided into 3 parts, starting with, what has being a recreation therapist taught you? Has everybody got it? So what I'm going to ask you to do is actually, since you're all at tables, is to talk with the people at your table and to talk about those questions. Talk about whatever part or parts seem relevant to you. There's not really time to answer all those questions fully, so just talk about your first reactions to them. There aren't any right or wrong answers to them. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes or so. So you can go ahead and turn to your neighbor and have a little conversation about those questions. So I asked you to do that exercise for several reasons. One, I know that this is a long time to just sit and just listen to one person talk. 2, I thought that the exercise could be helpful. Reflecting on what we've learned can be a very powerful way to tap into meaning and purpose. And reason number 3 for doing this exercise goes back to one of the lessons I've learned from brain injury. I focus on what I can do in the present. This is a long time for me to be standing up here talking. Part of the reality of my brain injury, is that talking makes me tired. So I designed that exercise to give my brain a few minutes of rest. So thank you all for being part of my strategy. I'm now ready to continue. Early on after my brain injury, I decided that I needed a lighthearted way to describe it, something that would make me and others laugh. A lot of times it seems like there's me and then there's the brain injury. It's kind of like there are two different people who are living inside my head. It's kind of crowded in there sometimes. So I decided that I'm going to name the brain injury. I call her Brain Hilda. Brain Hilda is a tyrant. She is the diva who lives in my head. My entire medical team is very familiar with Brain Hilda and all of her antics. When Brain Hilda decides it's time for me to rest, there is no arguing with her. No matter what I've planned to do, want to do, need to do, no matter where I am, who I'm with, or how much fun I'm having, if I don't honor her and lie down to rest, she will force me down. She gives me two choices, lie down or fall down. Believe me, I've done both. I tell you all that as mentioning another important part of happiness, humor. To continue with my door and key metaphor, humor is the WD-40, the grease that makes everything move just a little bit more smoothly. Humor, of course, doesn't change a bad situation, but it does somehow make it a little bit more bearable. I spoke about choosing to learn from brain injury a few minutes ago. Just like learning, laughing is a choice. When Brain Hilda rears her ugly head and confines me to rest on my couch, my first instinct is to cry. And believe me, over the years, I have cried buckets of tears over all of this. But with time, I've learned to see the humor. For example, one time I went to my doctor and I said, you know, over the last umpteen years, I have rested so much, I've gotten so much beauty sleep, that one of these days, I just know I'm going to wake up as a supermodel. This morning was not the morning. Okay, so I've regained independence, competence, and purpose. I've even been able to laugh at my situation. I should be happy, right? Well, I wasn't. The ongoing symptoms of the brain injury would often push me into sadness and despair. And then one day, this was more than 10 years ago now, I was meeting with my counselor, and she asked me this question: is it possible for you to accept that you're not going to make a full recovery? Can you still have a happy life? With that question, I instantly started crying. Not just a couple of tears, but outright sobbing, the loud, can't catch your breath, kind of hysterical, sort of embarrassing kind of sobbing. In that moment, the fact that my old life really was over, it just seared through me in a way that it never had before. In that moment, what I realized was I'd been judging every bit of improvement, every bit of my life really, against the standard of the old Carol. My happiness was conditional. It was dependent on how close to normal I was functioning. The closer to normal I was, the happier I was. In other words, I was still desperately trying to unlock my old door of happiness. I had thought that regaining independence, competence, and purpose would unlock the door to my old life. But they didn't, because in fact, they are the keys to my new door of happiness. After that conversation with my counselor, I was more able to stop judging myself against the old Carol and focus more on accepting and learning to appreciate the new Carol. In coming to terms with brain injury or any other kind of challenge, there comes a time to stop looking back at the life that was, the life that's over, and focus on the life that is, the life of the present. Until that flip happens, people stay stuck and unhappy because they're always looking backward. For me, that process took roughly the first 5 years of my brain injury. On an interesting side note, my counselor heard me give this speech a few years ago, and afterwards she told me that she had been asking me that exact question about happiness and recovery in various forms for quite a long time, and I never reacted to it. So you just never know when the right question asked at the right time is going to make a lasting impact. Another reason to never, never, never give up. Sometimes the way forward during a challenge isn't to do more, to try harder. Rather, it's to let go, to surrender. Notice I did not say give up, but rather surrender. Let go. They are different. Understanding that was my next big happiness breakthrough. That was about 8 years ago now. Then, despite the fact that I liked myself again and mostly accepted the brain injury, I still struggled with how unpredictable my symptoms were. I just never knew when a sudden noise, movement, too much thinking, too much talking was suddenly going to overwhelm me. Despite my careful plans, things would often go badly. I've overloaded and been driven home unexpectedly from so many places that I think my car has spent more nights away from home than I have. I've also napped in so many odd locations over the years that I tell people I sleep around. My personal slogan is one that any Trekkies in the audience will like: to boldly nap where no one has napped before. Clearly, I find it funny now, but for a long time I didn't. And I kept trying to find the right strategy, the right treatment that would stop me from overloading. Then, 8 years ago, I went through a time where I had trouble sleeping, which of course just left me even more tired. As this was going on, it hit me. My life is always going to be like this. There is always going to be some brain injury symptom or other to deal with, no matter what I do. No matter how hard I work, I simply cannot change the fact that I have a brain injury. I'd had that thought before. It had always depressed me. But on that day, I found it freeing. On that day, I finally truly let go, gave in, surrendered. I stopped fighting what I had no control over. I realized that I didn't need to triumph over brain injury in order to be happy. I could accept both the symptoms and their unpredictability. It was a feeling of victory, not defeat. I know it doesn't make logical sense, but letting go, surrendering, really is something that can be a catalyst for moving forward. Now, surrendering and letting go haven't miraculously cured my brain injury. I still tire easily, overload, sometimes need rescuing. I still deal with sound, visual, and balance sensitivities. I still spend more time resting on my couch than I'd like, and sometimes I feel sad about what I can't do. My brain injury symptoms are annoying, time-consuming, and limiting. Like I said earlier, kind of sucks. Letting go means that I accept all of those things, and I focus on what I can do right now. Letting go means that despite everything, I choose to be happy anyway. Letting go doesn't mean I've given up trying to improve. I still see half a dozen different doctors and therapists, and I continue to make progress, slowly and in small steps. Even now, 16 years post-injury, I refuse to give up. Letting go means that I trust that where I am right now in my recovery, even if that place is my couch, is where I'm supposed to be. I can be happy in the present moment, even as I strive to improve. That breakthrough 8 years ago opened wide my new door of happiness. Since that time, I've been consistently happier than I was even before my injury. As I've talked about these breakthroughs I've had over the years, they might sound almost magical. Maybe some of you are thinking, how did she do that? Or I could never do that. Or how do I help my patient accomplish that? In the early years after my brain injury, I remember listening to long-term survivors talk about letting go and moving on and thinking, there's no way on this green earth I could ever do that. But I did, and yes, it is possible. In preparing this speech and thinking more deeply about the acceptance and letting go epiphanies that I described, they seemed less like instant magic and more like hard-won endpoints in a very long process. I'm going to compare them to the process of a child learning how to ride a bicycle. The magic part comes when the parent who's been running alongside holding the seat lets go, and the child flies. Each epiphany I described to you was that kind of magic moment. But I'm sure most of you out there have learned how to ride a bike or taught a child how to, maybe both. Then you know that success generally doesn't happen on the first try, or the second, or the third, even though we type A perfectionist high achievers kind of think it should. It takes a lot of practice. Before the magic comes a lot of hard work. Sweat, tears, bumps, bruises, frustration, falls, maybe even a few curse words muttered under the breath. It doesn't seem like it's ever going to happen. But eventually, the muscles get strong enough, coordinated enough, and confident enough to take on the task. Then there's magic. So it's been with each of my epiphanies. The individual moments I described to you were the culmination of years of talking and writing, thinking and listening, crying and laughing, learning and using strategies, falling down and getting back up. Recreational activities were a huge part of that process. Every step I took, even the ones that felt like they were going backwards, were steps in the direction of my new door of happiness. Every medical professional I saw, no matter what their discipline, was part of that journey with me. Many years ago, I was watching Andy Rooney on the TV show 60 Minutes. He was talking about lessons he's learned over the years. He said, time doesn't heal all wounds, love does. That brings me to one final key that I haven't mentioned yet. I think that's because it's really been an integral part of all of the others. I guess you could call it the master key. It's support. And it comes from so many sources, from family, friends, support groups, doctors, therapists. I know for a fact that I could not have gotten this far physically, mentally, or emotionally without the dedication, patience, and optimism of my entire team. Recreational activities and recreation therapy treatment played a crucial role in my journey back to happiness. So I want to take this moment to specifically recognize recreation therapist Kathy Kroll. Kathy, I know that I put you through your paces. Kath, I know I put you through your paces when I was a patient, and still do sometimes, but I so appreciate all that you've done for me. You have been an integral part of my brain injury journey and have helped me go from recreation to recreation, so thank you. Brain injury has taken me on a road I never could have foreseen and to lows I didn't know existed. But in addition to happiness, I've also found courage and insight that I didn't know I had. Early on in my speech, I read you my poem, Phoenix, which ended with a question. The tree will have her time again. Will I? I always knew that I'd eventually write a response to that. It took several years, but here's my answer. This poem is titled Phoenix, Revisited. At the end of my street, on the edge of the marsh, stands a tree. The haunting, hoping desire, the tree will have her time again. Will I? Finally answered with a quiet confidence. No. For that is the wrong question. I am no longer that tree. I'm a new being on a new journey. Spinning, sailing, falling, flailing, writhing, wailing, landing. In my own soft space. Safe to root and to rise. To live this new time. As recreation therapists, you are uniquely positioned to help your patients to root and to rise, to find their new doors of happiness. From where I stand right now, at my new door of happiness, I'm very glad I never gave up. Thank you.